You have just read about the differences between student-centered learning environments and teacher-centered learning environments. As you watch this video and listen to the example scenarios, keep the following questions in the back of your mind. What are the characteristics that differentiate student-centered learning from teacher-centered learning? What are the pros and cons present in each teaching scenario? How, if at all, would you change each practice scenario to create a positive learning experience? By this point, you have probably noticed how important it is to create a student-centered learning environment in your classroom whenever possible. Let's put this information into practice. Pay close attention to the following 4 learning scenarios. As you listen, determine whether the example portrays a student-centered or teacher-centered classroom. And consider the possible outcomes of each scenario. A science teacher is teaching her middle school students about speed and velocity. After a brief overview of speed and velocity, the teacher gives each student a stopwatch. The class then goes outside to the school's soccer field. The teacher instructs the students to walk, jog, or run 3 laps around the field, pausing to write down the total elapsed time as they complete each lap. When the students return to the classroom, they use scientific formulas to calculate their speed for each lap and their average overall speed in miles or kilometers per hour. The students then compare and contrast their speeds in small group discussions. For example, a student who chose to walk could compare speeds with a student who ran all 3 laps. The scenario that you just heard is an example of student-centered learning. In this activity, the focus is on both the teacher and the student. Conversely, in teacher-centered learning, the focus is most entirely on the teacher. The teacher shows her students how to apply the concept of speed to their own activities instead of expecting them to simply memorize formulas. This way, students have a chance to apply and evaluate their own learning. The students have the chance to work by themselves and with other students. In teacher-centered learning, students usually work alone. Finally, because the lesson involves hands-on examples and group discussions, this student-centered classroom will be noisy and busy, rather than the quiet, teacher-centered classroom. Now let's listen to scenario number 2. A science teacher is planning to teach her class about the structure of atoms. The day before the lesson, the students were instructed to read a chapter about atomic structure in their textbook. The next day, the teacher lectures the students for 30 minutes about protons, electrons, and neutrons. The students are then given a pop quiz to work on individually. In the pop quiz, they must label a diagram of a carbon atom and describe each part of the atom. The scenario you have just heard is an example of teacher-centered learning. In this lesson, the students focus entirely on the teacher during class. Remember that in the student-centered lesson, in scenario number 1, the class focused on both the teacher and other students. Here, the teacher lectured at length, giving few opportunities for classroom discussion or creative application of scientific concepts. The teacher evaluates her students' learning through the pop quiz. The students did not have an opportunity in this lesson to check their own progress in this particular lesson. The students worked entirely alone, rather than in small groups or large groups. And because the lesson involves lecturing and individual graded activities, the classroom is likely to be very quiet. Now on to scenario 3. A high school English teacher is preparing to teach his students about the works of William Shakespeare. He assigns each of his 20 students an act from one of Shakespeare's plays. The students are to create a report analyzing their assigned act, and they are expected to give a 10-minute-long presentation to the class based on their report. Though the students are free to ask the teacher questions, he expects them to work on their presentations alone without the help of other students or their parents. The teacher will grade each of his students on a rubric that scores their writing style, presentation skills, depth of analysis, and effort, among other factors. The scenario you have just heard is an example of teacher-centered learning. Here, the students are working alone even though they will deliver their presentations to the entire class, since the teacher expects the students' work in creating the presentations to be entirely an individual effort. The students are allowed to interact with the teacher and ask questions. However, they are not allowed to work in groups or give each other advice. The teacher chose the topics for his students, and the teacher evaluates his students' learning by using a strict rubric. Even if the other students are allowed to ask questions at the end of each presentation, the grading is entirely in the teacher's hands. Now, one last scenario. Another high school teacher is finishing a lesson about Charles Dickens. For the lesson's final project, the teacher divides his class into 5 equally sized groups. Each group must develop a list of 5 possible presentation topics that would link one of Dickens' books to a current world event. The group will then meet with the teacher to narrow the list down to one final topic. Once the group has selected a topic, they are expected to develop a presentation to deliver to the class. The teacher encourages the groups to be creative, for example, creating plays, songs, or visual presentations. After each group's presentation, the other groups will work together to write an evaluation of the presentation, and the peer evaluations will count towards 25% of each group's final grade. The scenario you have just heard is an example of student-centered learning. In this activity, students work together in small groups, occasionally meeting with the teacher for advice. Because they are working in groups, the students will have ample time to answer each other's questions and group think, instead of relying solely on the teacher. Unlike scenario 3, the students are allowed to pick their potential topics, narrowing it down with the teacher's help. Though the teacher runs the risk of multiple groups proposing the same topics, students are more likely to connect with the material on a personal level. And in this teacher's lesson, students had a chance to actually grade their peers, since their evaluations count as 25% of the final grade. In this video, we applied the concepts of student-centered learning and teacher-centered learning to 4 hypothetical scenarios. We reviewed the characteristics of each method and analyzed how they differ. Remember the questions that you asked yourself at the beginning of this video. Now is a good time to answer these questions. Once you've done that, apply your answers to the scenarios in this video.